Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we're stitching pebbles in a spiral into one of our slash stars. And again, our slash star block is not going to fit the quilting guide completely. So let me give you some tips on marking this block so everything comes out just right. So here's our quilting guide for this block, and you can see we've got this big spiral in the center, filling in the star, and pebbling, lots of pebbling in this background area. Now, just in case you're looking for this quilting guide, you can find it in the Building Blocks quilt pattern available at leahday.com. Now, when it comes to this block, I have not marked the pebbling because I'm going to freehand quilt this design within the area. Pebbling is just stacked circles, and there's no right or wrong way of doing it. There's no right or wrong way of stacking it. So I would encourage you to consider also freehand quilting this rather than marking it. That will save you a lot of time simply because this is a lot of circles to have to mark on your block and stitch right on the line. The spiral is going to be maybe the harder thing within this block because your star is going to be either slightly smaller or slightly bigger than what this one looks like. It's usually a little bit bigger and a lot wonkier. But the easy thing is that this is one piece of fabric here. There's no seam allowances within the center of it, so it should be fairly easy to position the center spiral roughly over the center section of your block. It's not going to be exact, so don't worry about it too much. Just try and get that general area marked. And I left these outer areas unmarked. I'm just going to freehand quilt those, the echoes, radiating out into the star arms. So let's get on the machine and I can show you how all of that works in free motion. So here we are on the block, and I have already stitched it in the ditch. I've done the outline of the star, so stitching this area. I have also filled in a lot of these sections with pebbling. So my pebbling's already knocked out, and I'm going to just go on ahead and show you the pebbling that I'm using for this block. I'm going to be swinging out with some really big pebbles for this design. I really want to eat up as much space as I can with every circle that I stitch. I'm not concentrating so much on forming perfect circles as in just simply butting up the shapes next to each other. I don't care if I end up with ovals, or slightly wonky, like, almost potato shapes. I don't really care about stuff like that. I just want them to definitely touch each other, have them stacking together, locking together, and also running up against the edges of the star itself. I think that's really going to make the star stand out. Sometimes I will wiggle in and do a little circle if I feel like it's necessary, but I'm not locking this texture up too much. I don't feel like it's necessary to really build up. I'm not trying to do my build up version of pebbling with this one. I'm just knocking it out with some big circles. You can see I just did some half circles there. There's many ways that you can stitch pebbling. I could be doing a lot more travel stitching. I could be filling up all of these little tiny areas, these little gaps, with little circles too, but for this particular block I'm just wanting to knock it out, and the fastest way to knock it out is to stitch big circles, lock them together, but don't worry too much about the empty spaces between them. Another even faster method for knocking this out would be to stitch it with underwater rocks, which we've learned in a previous video. I'll make sure to link up that video so you can see it too. Underwater rocks is also a really fast way to flow through an area, and it looks a lot like pebbling, but it's even more intense. It's got a lot more thread texture going on. Okay, so I'm satisfied with that. That's my pebbling for that section. It's not perfect. Some of my circles are a little wonky, potato shaped or ovals or whatever, but I'm perfectly happy with that. I think it's great. Okay, I'm going to travel on down, stitching in this ditch. I'm going to get to the center so I can knock out my spiral. And you can see just, what I've basically done whenever I laid out my spiral on the graph, whenever I laid out my block on the graph, I just generally tried to get this shape in the center of that area, and that worked out really well. Now the one thing about it is these are rings. These are actual rings radiating out. If you wanted to, you can kind of make, this is I think a 4-inch circle right here in the center with the spiral inside of it, and so then that's probably a 5-inch circle on the outer ring of that. and they're not connecting, so this ring is not connecting to this ring, so I'm going to break thread between them. The good thing is I'm only going to have to do that one time because all the rest of these rings are going to butt up into the sides, you know, of the star. So I'm only going to break thread once to knock out my center spiral. I think I'm going to stitch, going ahead and knock out this outer ring and then start hitting these echoes, and I can show you what that's going to look like. And basically you just start stitching on the line. This is a pretty big ring, a pretty big space to fill. So I'm going to have to stop and reposition my hands occasionally so that way I don't stitch too wonky, I don't stitch off the line too badly. Again, this is a little tricky because we are crossing the different colors. You know, we're kind of going from fabric A to fabric B to fabric A. It can be really easy to stitch out of your star and into the background. So that's why I kind of knocked out that pebbling first, just so I would have that there and, you know, filled in, so that way I would remember, okay, that area has already been filled, I don't need to stitch into that area. Okay, so this looks good. I'm going to go ahead and knock out this area with my echoes so that way you can see what that looks like. Of course, if you feel the need to mark your echoes, please do so. I've marked some of mine, but not all of them. Basically what I'm doing is I'm travel stitching about 1/2 inch away from that circle shape. I'm estimating my space. This is visual. I am not grabbing a ruler to measure it. I'm just visually estimating about 1/2 inch away. And now I'm going to swing around with my echo, trying to maintain that distance away from that circle. And I know that you want to see me stitch this center spiral, so I'm going to break thread right here and work my way into that center. And it's always a good idea whenever you're breaking thread and you're still having to do some stitching on a block, go on ahead and give that top thread a tug and pull on the little loop that comes up, and that's your bobbin thread. Pull it up to the surface. You have both threads on the surface, you at least know where they're at. If you leave that thread on the back, a lot of times you can stitch over it and it'll make a big mess on the quilt. Okay, I'm going to start right here. Pull up my thread and tuck both of them underneath the presser foot. Sometimes they can get a little unruly and they don't want to behave. You just kind of force them under there. I like my threads underneath the presser foot simply because it helps me control them. They won't get sucked down into the machine or make a big mess on the back of the quilt that way. Okay, so now I'm going to swing around with my circle. And again, this shape is bigger than the circumference or the kind of frame that I'm making with my hands. So I'm probably going to have to stop and reposition at some point. Well, yeah. At that point, I felt like I needed to reposition my hands. And I also want to go on ahead and take care of this thread tail. I'm going to stitch down so that way you can actually see what I'm doing. Woo! It's a good idea to only ever hit your hit your speed, start actually stitching when your hands are ready to go. There we go, that's close enough, I think you can see. Yep. So hiding this, all I'm going to do is tie an overhand knot. Pull the thread tails through, and I'm taking that knot down to about 1/8 of an inch from the surface of the quilt. I'm pulling it tight. Now I've got a cheater needle. I'm going to back up the camera so that you can definitely see this. I've got a cheater needle here, and I'm going to insert it. I always kind of put a hand to the back so I can feel. I insert the cheater needle into the middle layer of the quilt where the batting is, and run it about 1 inch. Flip it over and I double check what it looks like. I make sure that the needle's not coming out the back. That looks good. It's a cheater needle, meaning self-threading. It has a little groove in the surface of the needle, so I don't have to thread it the traditional way. I can just pop, you heard that pop, into the eye of the needle. Now you need to pull out just a little bit of the thread so that way it doesn't pull out of the needle as you send it through the quilt. Okay. So that thread tail is hidden, and now as I stitch up to that area, I can meet up with it and it will be a completely seamless finish. A lot of times I will go on ahead and hide a tail if I know I'm coming in and needing to match with it. So I'm going to zoom in again so that way you can see how I stitch right up to that spot. The nice thing about this block is the seam allowances aren't too bad. Because of our wonky piecing, the seam allowances really didn't have a chance to build up too much in any particular spot. Okay, so that I just stitch right on top of my, basically that break, that end point. And now I'm going to knock out my spiral, stitch right back off of this and into that center circle. I do think marking your spiral is nice. It will get it, a nice accurate placement. It will make it easier to stitch. Spirals can be tricky because they kind of force your brain to think differently. You have to, as you stitch in, you're leaving extra space for yourself to get out. And I don't know about you, but when I first got started, I could not remember to leave myself space, so I was always locking my spirals up. But that is that spiral knocked out. And at this point, I'm just simply going to break thread and work my way around all of these basically star legs, star arms, and knock out the rows of Eka quilting, and then the block will be complete. So that's it for stitching pebbles and a spiral into one of our slash stars. These slash stars are a little unpredictable. They are very wonky, and fitting and filling things that we have planned ahead of time into this block, you're going to have to make some adjustments. Certainly breaking thread to get into that center spiral, I wasn't really planning on having to do that when I designed this block, but because my block came out the way it did and I placed the spiral where I placed it, that was what was required. And that's perfectly fine. An extra thread break doesn't make the block any better or any worse. It's just simply one of those things that you sometimes have to do if that's what you've designed and what you plan to put into your quilt. I do think that not marking the pebbling, instead freehand quilting that design into the background is a good idea. It'll give you a lot of bang for your buck, a lot of practice placing and stitching those circles freehand, and also, of course, travel stitching, being able to match those circles together so that they fill in the space nicely. You can get a lot of bang for your buck by doing that. So I encourage you to freehand quilt that and get some practice with pebbling as well. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt-Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and join us as we learn how to piece and free motion quilt 42 beautiful blocks together. You can pick up your pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt!